The pre-dawn air bit through Morningstar's buckskin dress as she crept between the hide-covered lodges of her people. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing the forbidden word that had driven her to this desperate act: freedom. Behind her, the sacred fire that never died cast dancing shadows across the settlement where no man had walked in 7 winters. "You will marry Stone Bear when the snow melts," Grandmother Hawk's words from the evening before still rang in her ears. "It is decided. Our people need alliance with his tribe." Morningstar's fingers trembled as she adjusted the leather pouch containing her few possessions: dried meat, her mother's silver bracelet, and the small knife her aunt had secretly taught her to use. At 22, she was the last unmarried woman in their isolated community, a village born from tragedy when the men had been slaughtered in a cavalry raid, and the surviving women had sworn never again to depend on any man's protection. But Morningstar had never taken that oath. She had been only a child then, raised on stories of male brutality, yet harboring secret dreams of something beyond the endless cycle of gathering, weaving, and tending the sacred flames. She had seen Stone Bear once, a weathered warrior of 45 winters with cold eyes and hands that spoke of violence. The thought of his touch made her skin crawl. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains. She pulled her elk-hide cloak tighter and quickened her pace toward the edge of the settlement. Her moccasins made no sound on the frost-hardened earth as she passed the lodge where Grandmother Hawk slept, unaware that her carefully laid plans were crumbling into the mountain air. As Morningstar reached the tree line, she turned back one last time. The circle of lodges looked small and fragile against the vast Wyoming wilderness, smoke rising from the central fire like prayers to ancestors who might never forgive what she was about to do. She had been taught that a woman alone in the white man's world faced only death or dishonor. But what honor was there in a marriage that felt like burial? "I'm sorry," she whispered to the wind, then turned her back on the only life she had ever known. The forest swallowed her slight figure as she began climbing the rocky trail that led toward the territorial settlements. She had overheard the hunters speak of a valley beyond the high pass where white ranchers kept their cattle. If she could reach there, perhaps she could find work, maybe even passage to the railroad towns where a woman might disappear entirely. Hours passed as she climbed, her breath coming in sharp puffs in the thinning air. The trail grew treacherous, winding between granite outcroppings and across narrow ledges where one misstep meant death. Her legs ached, and her water was nearly gone, but behind her lay a life of suffocation, and ahead lay possibility, terrifying and unknown, but possibility nonetheless. As the sun reached its zenith, exhaustion finally claimed her. She stumbled, her vision blurring from hunger and fatigue, and fell to her knees beside a small stream. The icy water revived her enough to drink deeply and refill her water pouch, but when she tried to stand, her legs betrayed her. "Not now," she gasped, forcing herself upright. The pass was still miles away, and she could see storm clouds gathering on the peaks. If she didn't find shelter soon, the mountain itself would decide her fate. She pressed on, one agonizing step after another, her determination the only thing standing between her and the grave her grandmother would surely say she deserved. The wind began to howl, carrying the first stinging pellets of snow, and Morningstar realized she was racing not just toward freedom, but toward whatever destiny awaited a woman bold enough to choose her own path in a world that offered women precious few choices at all. Jake Thornton brought his axe down with practiced precision, splitting the pine log cleanly in two. Sweat glistened on his bare chest despite the October chill, his muscles rippling beneath sun-bronzed skin as he worked. At 25, 3 years of building his ranch from nothing had carved his body into something that could wrestle steers and outlast mountain winters with equal determination. He paused to wipe his brow with the back of his hand, scanning the valley that stretched before his modest cabin. 500 head of cattle dotted the grassland, their dark shapes moving slowly across the golden meadow. It wasn't much compared to the big spreads closer to Cheyenne, but it was his. Every fence post driven by his own hands, every head of cattle bought with money earned through back-breaking labor in the silver mines. The wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, and Jake frowned at the darkening clouds. An early storm could scatter his herd and cost him everything he'd worked for. He needed to bring the cattle closer to the shelter of the valley bottom before nightfall. As he pulled on his wool shirt, a movement on the mountainside caught his eye. A figure was stumbling down the rocky slope above his property, someone in trouble by the look of it. Jake shaded his eyes with his hand, trying to make out details. Too small to be a man, moving wrong to be anything but exhausted or injured. He grabbed his Winchester from beside the cabin door and started up the slope. Living alone in the territory meant being ready for anything, claim jumpers, cattle thieves, or worse. But as he drew closer, his suspicions gave way to concern. The figure was a young woman, her dark hair hanging in tangles, her buckskin dress torn and muddy. She looked like she was about to collapse. "Miss!" he called out, breaking into a run as she swayed dangerously near the edge of a steep drop. "Hold on there!" Morningstar heard the deep voice and spun around, her heart lurching with terror. A man, the first she had seen up close in 7 years, was running toward her with a rifle in his hands. Everything Grandmother Hawk had taught her about the brutality of males flooded back, and she stumbled backward, her feet sliding on loose stones. But as Jake came within 20 yards, something extraordinary happened. The pure panic that had driven her steps faltered as her eyes took in the sight before her. This wasn't the monster of her nightmares. The man slowing to a stop was young, with concerned blue eyes, and a face that spoke of strength tempered by kindness. His shirt hung open over a chest that made her mouth go dry, and when he raised his hands to show he meant no harm, the gesture revealed arms that could probably break her in half. Yet something in his expression suggested he never would. "Easy there," Jake said softly, the way he would gentle a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you. You look like you could use some help." Morningstar stood frozen, her mind reeling. Her body was responding to this stranger in ways she had never experienced, a strange heat pooling in her belly, her pulse racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. She had been taught that desire was weakness, that men used such feelings to destroy women. But looking at Jake Thornton, she felt like she was seeing the sun for the first time. She began, then found she had no words in English for what was happening to her. Jake noticed her clothing now, unmistakably native, but different from the Lakota and Cheyenne he'd encountered in town. Her features were delicate, beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten, but she was clearly terrified, and something about her condition suggested she was running from something. "You're safe," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "My name's Jake. I've got a cabin down there, food and water. You look like you haven't eaten in days." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Morningstar had expected violence, had steeled herself for the worst. Instead, this powerful man was offering shelter, speaking to her as if she mattered. When he gestured toward his cabin, she saw calloused hands that had clearly known hard work, not the soft palms of someone who took what he wanted through force. "You help me?" she asked in halting English, the words unfamiliar on her tongue. "Course I will," Jake replied, though warning bells were going off in his head. A native woman alone on his land could mean trouble from every direction. Her people might come looking for her, and the territorial authorities wouldn't look kindly on him harboring what they'd consider a potential threat. But looking at her exhausted, hopeful face, he found he didn't much care about the consequences. As snowflakes began to fall around them, Jake extended his hand. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Morningstar stared at that outstretched hand, the first a man had ever offered her in friendship rather than dominance. When she placed her trembling fingers in his, the contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, and she knew with crystalline certainty that her life had just changed forever. The warmth of Jake's cabin enveloped Morningstar like an embrace as he guided her through the heavy wooden door. She had never been inside a white man's dwelling, and her eyes darted nervously around the single room that somehow managed to feel both foreign and welcoming. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn furniture and shelves lined with books, more books than she had ever seen in one place. "Sit," Jake said gently, guiding her toward a chair near the fire. "I'll get you something warm to eat." Morningstar perched on the edge of the wooden seat, her body rigid with uncertainty. The dress clung to her damp skin, and she was acutely aware of how she must look, bedraggled, wild, completely out of place in this ordered masculine space. But more unsettling was her awareness of Jake himself as he moved around the cabin, the way his broad shoulders stretched his shirt, the quiet competence in his every gesture. Jake ladled beef stew from a pot hanging over the coals, conscious of the young woman's nervous energy behind him. She reminded him of a deer ready to bolt at the first wrong move. He'd dealt with plenty of spooked animals in his time, but something about her wariness cut deeper. Whatever she was running from had left her expecting the worst from every encounter. "Here," he said, offering her the steaming bowl and a wooden spoon. "It's not fancy, but it'll put some strength back in you." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the bowl, and Jake felt the same electric shock he'd experienced when he helped her down the mountain. Her skin was soft despite the hardship she'd clearly endured, and when her dark eyes met his, he saw vulnerability mixed with something that made his pulse quicken. Morningstar took a tentative bite, then another, her hunger overcoming her nervousness. The rich flavor of the meat and vegetables was unlike anything she'd tasted, seasoned with herbs her people didn't use. As warmth spread through her body, she began to relax slightly, though she remained hyper-aware of Jake's every movement. "What's your name?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her, careful to maintain distance. "Morningstar," she replied, then added hesitantly, "Of the Eagle clan." Jake nodded, recognizing the caution in her voice. "Beautiful name." "You're Lakota?" She shook her head. "My people. We live apart. Only women. Long time now, only women." The pieces began falling into place for Jake. He'd heard rumors of isolated groups that had withdrawn from contact after the worst of the Indian Wars, communities that had turned inward to protect what remained. An all-female settlement would explain her obvious inexperience with men, her terror mixed with curiosity. "You ran away," he said gently. It wasn't a question. Morningstar's hand tightened on the spoon. "They want me to marry Old Warrior. I cannot. I will not." The pain in her voice made Jake's chest tighten with protective anger. "So you chose to risk everything, rather than accept a life you didn't want?" She looked up at him, surprised by the understanding in his tone. "You not angry? White men in stories, they hate when women choose for themselves." "I'm not those men," Jake said quietly. "And I figure a person has the right to decide their own fate, man or woman." The simple words hit Morningstar like a physical blow. In her world, women's choices were made by grandmothers and clan mothers, their paths decided by tradition and necessity. The idea that this powerful man, who could easily overpower her, who owed her nothing, would support her right to choose her own life, was almost too much to comprehend. Outside, the wind howled as the storm intensified, rattling the cabin's windows. Snow began piling against the glass, and Jake realized with a mixture of concern and anticipation that she wouldn't be leaving tonight, possibly not for days. "Storm's getting worse," he observed, moving to peer out the window. "You'll have to stay until it passes." Panic flashed across Morningstar's face. Alone with a man overnight, everything she'd been taught screamed that this was how women fell, how they lost themselves to male dominance and desire. But as Jake turned back to her, she saw no predatory gleam in his eyes, only genuine concern for her safety. "I will not dishonor myself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake understood immediately. "You'll have the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. And Morningstar?" He waited until she met his eyes. "Nothing happens here that you don't want to happen. You have my word." The sincerity in his voice, the respect in his manner, chipped away at 7 years of careful conditioning. Morningstar found herself studying this man who defied everything she'd been taught to expect, and for the first time since fleeing her village, she felt something other than fear about what tomorrow might bring. As the storm raged outside, trapping them together in the warm circle of firelight, both realized they were about to discover just how much two people from different worlds could learn about themselves when forced to see past the barriers that had always divided them. Morningstar woke to the sound of chopping wood and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. Grey dawn light filtered through frost-covered windows, and she realized the storm had passed during the night. She had slept deeply in Jake's bed, wrapped in blankets that smelled of pine and leather, and something uniquely masculine that had made her dreams restless in ways she couldn't name. Jake had kept his word, sleeping on a bedroll by the dying fire, but she had been acutely aware of his presence all night, his steady breathing, the occasional rustle as he shifted position. More than once she had found herself wondering what it would feel like to curl against his broad chest, to feel those strong arms around her. The thoughts had left her burning with shame and a deeper heat she didn't understand. "Morning," Jake called as she emerged from behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area. "Coffee's ready if you want some." He was fully dressed, his hair damp from washing in the cold water basin. The sight of him in the morning light, stubble darkening his jaw, his shirt open at the throat, made her pulse skip in that dangerous way that had become familiar since meeting him. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tin cup he offered. The bitter liquid was nothing like the herbal teas of her people, but the warmth was welcome. "Storm's moved on, but there's about 2 feet of snow out there," Jake reported, settling across from her at the small wooden table. "Trail down the mountain won't be passable for at least a week, maybe 2. Morningstar's heart leaped. Whether from joy or terror, she couldn't say. More time with Jake meant more opportunities for the confusing feelings he stirred in her to overwhelm her better judgment. But it also meant safety from the searchers who were surely coming, and more chances to understand this man who challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. "I will work," she said firmly. "I not take your food, your shelter without giving back." Jake studied her determined expression and nodded. "Fair enough. Can you handle livestock?" "I know horses, cattle. Maybe I learn. Then you can help me check on the herd. Make sure they weathered the storm all right. But first," he hesitated, then forged ahead. "That dress isn't going to keep you warm in snow this deep. I've got some old clothes that might fit." The idea of wearing men's clothing should have horrified her, but Morningstar found herself nodding. Survival mattered more than modesty, and something about the practical concern in Jake's voice made the suggestion feel protective rather than improper. An hour later, she stood in front of Jake's small mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The wool pants were too long and had to be rolled up. The flannel shirt hung loose on her slender frame, but the sturdy boots fit reasonably well. Her long black hair was braided down her back, and for the first time in her life, she looked like she could move freely, work alongside men as an equal. "You look—" Jake paused in the doorway, struck by the transformation. The practical clothes somehow emphasized rather than hid her feminine curves, and seeing her in his clothing stirred something possessive and protective in his chest. "You look ready for anything." The approval in his voice sent warmth flooding through her. No one had ever looked at her like that, as if she were capable, valuable, beautiful in her own right, rather than just a potential bearer of children and keeper of traditions. They spent the morning trudging through snow-covered pastures, checking on cattle that had huddled together for warmth near the windbreak Jake had built. Morningstar proved surprisingly adept at reading the animals' conditions, her gentle approach calming nervous heifers, while Jake examined them for signs of frostbite or injury. "You're a natural," he told her, as they shared a midday meal beside a small fire he'd built to warm their hands. "Cattle respond to you the way they do to someone who understands them. Animals, they do not lie," Morningstar replied, pulling off her gloves to warm her fingers over the flames. "They show you true feelings, not hide behind words or customs." Jake caught the deeper meaning in her observation. "Is that what people in your village did? Hide behind customs?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Grandmother Hawk, she say men are evil, that they only bring pain and death. All women in my village, they believe this because of old hurts. But looking at you," she raised her eyes to his face, "I think maybe some pain comes from never letting yourself see truth." The honesty in her words, the trust implicit in sharing them, hit Jake like a physical blow. Without thinking, he reached across the small space between them and covered her bare hand with his own. The contact sent electricity racing up both their arms, and neither pulled away. "Morningstar," he said quietly, "what you're feeling, it's not wrong, and it doesn't make you weak." She stared down at their joined hands, his so much larger and rougher than hers, yet gentle in a way that made her heart race. "In my village they say desire is how women lose themselves, become slaves to men." "Maybe," Jake said, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "Or maybe it's how two people find something stronger than either of them could be alone." When she looked up at him, Jake saw the internal battle raging behind her dark eyes. Years of conditioning warring with awakening feelings, fear struggling against longing. Very slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lifted his free hand to cup her cheek. "I won't push," he promised, "but I won't pretend I don't feel this either." Morningstar leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as his thumb brushed across her cheekbone. For the first time in her life, she understood what the older women had whispered about in hushed tones, the pull between man and woman that could override sense and tradition. But with Jake, it didn't feel like losing herself. It felt like finally finding who she was meant to be. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning silence like gunfire. Jake dropped the fence post he was setting and reached for his rifle, while Morningstar froze beside him, her face draining of color. Through the trees, they could see riders cresting the ridge, 5 mounted figures moving with the purposeful determination of a hunting party. "They found me," Morningstar whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake squinted at the approaching riders, recognizing the distinctive clothing and weapons of Plains warriors. But something was wrong with the picture. These riders moved with an urgency that spoke of desperation rather than confident pursuit. "Stay behind me," Jake ordered, but Morningstar stepped forward instead, her chin lifting with sudden resolve. "No more hiding," she said firmly. If I run again, I run forever. Better to face truth now. The lead rider was a woman, Jake realized with surprise, a weathered matriarch with grey-streaked hair and eyes like flint. Behind her rode 4 younger women, all armed with rifles and grim expressions. They reined in their horses 20 yards away, the leader's gaze moving from Morning Star to Jake with undisguised hostility. "Morning Star," the older woman called in accented English. "I am Grandmother Hawk. You will come home now." "I cannot, Grandmother," Morning Star replied, switching to her native tongue, but raising her voice so Jake could follow the tone, if not the words. "The path you chose for me leads only to death of spirit. And this?" Grandmother Hawk gestured toward Jake with contempt. "This white man offers you better than death? He will use you and cast you aside like all his kind do." Jake stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "Ma'am, I don't know what stories you've heard about white men, but I'm not interested in using anybody. Morning Star is free to make her own choices." The old woman's eyes narrowed. "Free? You think giving her men's clothes and filling her head with foolish ideas makes her free? You make her forget her people, her sacred duties." "Her sacred duty is to herself first," Jake replied evenly. "To be happy, to choose her own path. That's what freedom means." Grandmother Hawk's face twisted with rage. "Lies, sweet poison to corrupt her mind. Morning Star, if you do not come now, you are dead to us. No home, no people, no protection. You understand this?" Morning Star felt the weight of that ultimatum like a physical blow. To be cast out from her people meant losing not just her past, but her identity, her connection to everything that had shaped her. But looking at Jake, this man who had shown her kindness without seeking to control her, who respected her choices even when they complicated his own life, she realized she had already chosen. "I understand, Grandmother," she said quietly. "But I also understand that living without choice is not really living. You taught me to be strong. Now let me use that strength." "Foolish girl," Grandmother Hawk spat. "When he tires of you, when his people turn against you both, remember what you threw away for fleeting pleasure." "It's not about pleasure," Jake interjected, surprising everyone, including himself, with the raw honesty in his voice. "I love her, and if she'll have me, I want to build a life with her. A real life, where she's my equal partner, not my possession." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge to everything both their worlds believed about how men and women should relate to each other. Morning Star's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at Jake, seeing the truth of his declaration written in every line of his face. "You love me," she whispered. "Been trying not to say it too soon," Jake replied with a rueful smile. "But yeah, I love your courage, your strength, the way you see the world with fresh eyes. I love who you are, not what I think you should be." Grandmother Hawk made a sound of disgust. "Pretty words that will turn to ash when hardship comes. You know nothing of what waits for a native woman who chooses a white man's bed." "Maybe not," Jake admitted, "but we'll face whatever comes together. And if Morning Star wants to maintain connections to her heritage, to teach our children about their mother's people, I'll support that too." "Children?" Grandmother Hawk's voice was sharp with pain. "You think mixed-blood children will find welcome in either world? You doom them before they draw breath." Morning Star stepped closer to Jake, her decision crystallizing with each word. "Maybe our children will help build bridges between worlds instead of walls, Grandmother. Maybe love is stronger than fear if we let it be." The old woman studied her granddaughter's face for a long moment, reading the absolute determination there. Finally, she straightened in her saddle with the dignity of a queen accepting defeat. "Then you are no granddaughter of mine," she said formally. "Your name will not be spoken in our lodge. Your spirit place will be given to another. You are dead to the Eagle clan." The ritual words of banishment should have devastated Morning Star, but instead she felt a strange lightness, as if invisible chains had been broken. "Then I will make a new name, a new spirit place," she replied, "with the man who sees me as I truly am." Grandmother Hawk wheeled her horse around without another word, leading her companions back toward the high trail. They disappeared into the forest as suddenly as they had come, leaving only the sound of wind in the pines and the distant lowing of cattle. Jake turned to Morning Star, seeing the tears she was fighting to hold back. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "I know that was harder than you're letting on." "It was," she admitted, then looked up at him with eyes that held sorrow, but also hope. "But, Jake Thornton, when you said you loved me, I meant every word. Then I tell you truth, too. I love you. Love your kindness, your strength that protects instead of dominates. Love the way you make me believe I can be anything I choose to be." Jake pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as she finally let the tears fall, Tears for the life she was leaving behind, but also tears of joy for the one she was choosing to build. "What happens now?" she asked against his chest. "Now we figure it out together," Jake replied, pressing his lips to the top of her head. "Won't be easy. Folks in town might not understand. Your people have made their feelings clear. But Morning Star?" He tilted her chin up so she could see his eyes. "I'd rather face every challenge in the world with you than live safely without you." As the sun climbed higher over their valley, Jake and Morning Star stood wrapped in each other's arms, two people from different worlds who had found something worth fighting for in each other. Their love might face trials that would test them both, but they would meet those challenges as they had met everything else, together, with courage born of choice rather than fear. Behind them, the cattle grazed peacefully in the meadow, and smoke rose from the cabin chimney that would soon shelter not just a white rancher and a runaway native woman, but a family built on love, respect, and the radical belief that hearts could choose their own destiny regardless of the color of the skin that held them.